So now that you've taken a look at the planning side, we're going to take a look at the deployment phases. These are the phases that you're going to need to do to successfully get your SharePoint rolled out to your users and to your organization. The first one is, unfortunately, writing a deployment plan. Lots of writing and planning involved in this, so we're going to kind of go through all the different pieces there. Once you have that deployment plan in place, you'll go through the planning phase. This is where you actually get all the buy-in and you actually work through what's going to be involved with the whole system. Then you'll have your development phase. This may be a large phase for you. It may be simply acknowledging that you're not going to do any custom development, but you need to have it identified in the process. You'll have the review phase. Once everything's in place, you want to go back to the stakeholders and make sure that what you've said is what they understood and that everybody's in place. Then you test what you've got in place, making sure that what you've got on the servers is what's going to work for you. You'll do a rollout, which is a people phase where you go in and make sure that everyone understands what's coming and that they're all bought in with it. And then ideally you come to the end game, which is the support phase, which is operations, making sure everything's running, everybody's happy. So, writing your deployment plan. First of all, write it all down and then read it back. We so often actually go through and do write once documentation. It's very compelling. Nobody actually wants to read the plans, but they're useful. And going back through, you'll actually find things that you missed, things that may be changed as you were going through the documentation. So go through it a couple of times, work through it, make sure that what you've got down is what you actually intended. They're going to become your flight checklist. You're going to make sure that things aren't forgotten, that you're doing things in the right order, that you don't come into the end and go, oh yeah, or you've gotten yourself into a corner and you haven't really thought about how you're going to build your walkway out of it. So keep that in mind as you're going through. That should help you make sure that you're going to go through the entire process correctly and that you are actually reading it and not just skimming it. They're also there to make sure there aren't surprises for your content owners or users. As you go through it and think it through, then you'll actually be able to communicate it very well to the content owners or users. These are the people who are going to be living with your servers day to day. Ideally, you're just going to be monitoring them and checking them. They're going to actually be doing all of their work there. So you want to make sure that what you've described is what they need and that what they understand that what you're putting together and some of the things about what can be done and what can't. All the users would love for you to have the system do all of their work for them and they can go off and golf or whatever their hobby is. We know that that's not quite how things work, so they need to understand some of the compromises and some of the requirements that are in place that give them what's coming in. And a good deployment plan is invaluable for when the system gets updated later. Hopefully that's you, and when you come back around in SharePoint, whatever the next version is going to be, you'll actually have this plan and know exactly what you did. The concept of what's a legacy system, a system that's running very well and reliably, that means that you haven't probably looked at it in a while except for checking the logs or knowing that everything's continuing to run. It's amazing how quickly that becomes a system that you don't remember exactly the details. So if you've got that deployment plan and you've got everything documented, then when you come back and start doing your update for vNext, you're going to be in very good shape. The planning phase itself. This is where most of your time is going to end up in the entire process. This is where you actually know where you're going, where you gather your requirements, where you make sure that everything is in place for what you need to do. This is where you make sure that you know what your end goal is. Planning includes identifying metadata, user domains, external data stores, business connection interfaces, authentication sources, web crawls, etc., etc., etc. There are lots of pieces that come into play here, where there are some abilities to help work with this, but know that you're going to spend a lot of time meeting with users, with a lot of time meeting with your information architects, possibly even your developers to know what they can do. A good example of this is metadata. You want to make sure that you get correct metadata, but too often without proper planning, you either don't capture the metadata you need or you don't identify what's actually critical and you capture far too much metadata. I've actually seen a deploy where to upload a document into the system required 31 pieces of metadata. As we probably can guess, The system did not get used that much. So here is where you're trying to figure out exactly what you need and no more. What's critical, what's needed, what you have to have, and what's acceptable for the users for getting their job done. To help you with this, Microsoft actually has a number of worksheets. Here's the URL to find them currently. If that goes away, just search on TechNet and you'll be able to find the SharePoint deployment worksheets. Once you get finished with the planning, then you get to go to the part that we tend to like, the development phase, or the developers will like. This may or may not be a big phase for you, as I mentioned. This is where any custom applications are created. This is where your developers come in and create any new capabilities, any new code, or depending upon how your organization is put together. A lot of the enterprise workflow templates are done here, and even some large pieces of maybe column content or site templates can go into this phase. So you'll know those pieces come into place. Your designers will be creating your custom style sheets at this point. So this is all of those places where there's not specific content, but there's how content is going to be used, formatted, processed. All of those things go into this development phase. The development phase is likely the most parallel phase that you're looking at, but it's going to have the most diverse usages as well. This is where you're going to have possibly content owners, designers, developers, all working on different parts. And if you've got your worksheets created correctly, and if you've got your planning phase done well, you'll be able to keep them in sync. But be prepared for this to be the most herding cats area of your process, just because there are so many different things going on at the same time. Once you get your development done, then you have to come back and review it. This phase is for buy-in and QA. As I mentioned with development phase, it's a lot of cat herding. This is where you come back in and make sure that all of those different pieces synchronize back up to your plan very well. You want to do QA. This is also where different groups get to see what the others have done. If your developers have made some great SharePoint applications, but your designers have changed out the style sheets and had different tags, this is where you find out. Hopefully you'll have found out before, but this is where you confirm that each of the different groups are working on the same page. You're making sure that also that the stakeholders come into place. This is where your content owners get to see what those applications look like. This is where the custom columns actually tie into the templates. This is where all of the pieces come through, and that you're going to be able to say, yes, this is going to work as we move forward. Plan on with your review phase that you may actually need to go back into your development phase. You may need to do a couple of cycles here. If your group comes through and everything works great in the review phase, that's wonderful, but don't count on it. Know that you may have to go through, you may have to revert back into development phase, or at some points you may even have to go back into the planning phase if at this point you find out that things aren't linking up. So don't think that you come through review phase, schedule a week, everybody comes out and everything's happy. Ideally that's going to be what happens, but it so rarely actually comes out that way. Once you get in there and the review's okay, then you go into the testing phase. This is the full systems integration test. You should actually have the pieces in place on a small server or a small piece to make sure that once everybody's agreed that things are working, then you actually put the rubber to the road. You know where all the pieces come into place. You know that they hook up correctly. You know that as things are actually functioning as they've been designed and built. Should be done in an environment as close as possible on the production hardware. At this point, since you are testing, you should have your hardware in place, but you're probably not using it. If you've got that situation, use it on the production hardware environment. Then you can actually wipe it when you've actually when your testing is done, when you've gone and found out all the different edge cases, and you'll be ready to go for your production. You know you're in good shape and you're happy to go. Performance acceptance occurs here. This is why you actually want it as close to as possible in the production hardware, because only on the production hardware can you be assured that what your users are going to see is what you've been testing against. Slow systems not going to be accepted by users. As we've all seen, SharePoint has a lot of moving parts, and it's very easy to get one item to slow the system down when you roll it out. If your users are waiting for documents to upload for 2 or 3 minutes or even a minute, sometimes that's the difference between making the system work and not work, is being able to get that response time quick enough for them to be able to be comfortable with the system and to be able to fit into their workflow. Testing should never be scheduled for less than half of the development time, and all the resources used in development must be available during testing. Why is this? First of all, is because if you're actually doing the development, testing should actually go through all those scenarios that you've done in development. So if you're doing less than half of development time, you're probably not going through everything that the developers put into place. You're probably not looking at edge cases. You're probably not trying to figure out where things have been missed or where things aren't lining up. So you want to make sure and be thorough, make sure and be methodical, and part of that is giving plenty of time in for testing. And then all resources used in the development phase have to be available, because when you do find something, when you do need to get something fixed, you need to be able to pull those people in rapidly and accurately, have them review it, and actually get the fix in place. Because once you identify that something needs to be repaired, then you have to go back through, after it's taken care of, and go back through the testing process again. Because as we know, regression testing is very important, and if you don't have good regression testing, then something's going to slip through the cracks. Once you exit the testing phase, everything's working good, you're ready to go, then you do the rollout phase. This is the golden era of getting it out, getting your users access to the system, and making sure that you've got people seeing the results of your hard work. The rollout phase should be tailored to your organization. Often you'll see a situation where people tell you, oh, this is, you plan and you go by department, or you go by group, or you go by function. That's nice if you can do it, but know that your organizations, especially the larger organizations, need to have some planning in there about how it gets rolled out. You may have a situation where production floor can't get rolled out until project managers have access, or you need to have your content owners rolled out to first, because they're going to get all of their templates and they're going to get all of their information kind of dropped in, but they'll need to give additional detail, or there may be some systems where you haven't been capturing before that you need to put that information into place. So know that you need to look at that rollout phase and be aware of what your users are going to be doing and how they fit into that. Avoid the big switch if at all possible. Sometimes it's not possible to avoid this, but too often you'll see that the rollout phase is everybody go home on Friday. IT will work all weekend long getting the new system going, and Monday morning at 8 o'clock everybody comes in and it's a brand new world. That's really asking for problems. The reason why is, if anything at all has a problem, then you've got to roll everything back and do fixes, or you basically have a lot of risk there on turning everything over at once. If you can, deliver batches of functionality or batching users so that they come on and you're actually able to review what problems they have, what challenges, what things that you actually missed in all the other phases, because there will be some. You'll have situations where, yes, this is the process that we've actually put into place. Everything's perfect as by the book, but this group of users actually had some additional processes they didn't have rolled back into your organization, and now something's not fitting right, or something's not letting them get their jobs done. So know that you're going to come into those situations. If you've got batches, you're limiting your exposure to that, and being able to put those into place makes things very much easier as you go forward. Unfortunately, if the groups interoperate, or you have training schedules that you need to have people, they actually do have full-time jobs, or you assume they would, that may make difficult. If you do have to do larger groups, manage your rollouts very closely. Again, break them down into as smaller groups as possible so you can actually mitigate the risk and mitigate your challenges of putting those in there. The more interrelated your groups are going to be, the more that they're going to have to work with each other, the more you're going to have to pay attention to this, the more resources you may have in your rollout team to make sure that any answers or any misunderstandings are covered quickly, identified, managed, patched, or educated on, and roll out through there. And once you get through this and everybody's ready to take a break, you roll into support phase. This is where you want to get. Ideally, this is where you can actually start scheduling some vacations, and all of those resources can go on to the next project. Support phase begins when the tickets from rollouts are answered or deferred. We don't have to have all of them solved, but you can actually say, yes, we know this is an issue. This was go into phase 2 or a different project or those kind of things. You can push them off. This is your kind of, from an email term, zero inbox bounce. Things are coming in. You've actually got them managed. You know what you're going to do with them. And now you're going into standard operating procedure. Operations works with steady stage in support phase. You're managing, you're testing your backups, your storage levels, making sure that you've got enough disk space, making sure that everything's in place to be able to do operations. This doesn't mean that you won't be bringing new capabilities in, as your developers may be adding more SharePoint applications, more features, all of those will come into place, but you'll actually have a steady rhythm once you're in this mode and you're not worried about the entire base infrastructure, but you're pushing out all of the rest of the capabilities. So having looked at all of the phases, let's look at some of the tools that we can use to help you in these phases to make sure that you're going to be successful in your rollout. So, one of the first worksheets that Microsoft's provided is the Services on Server install worksheet. This is actually built to help you plan out which services and which capabilities will go on which of your servers in the farm. As you can see here, the services themselves are all listed, and you may have to add some additional ones if you actually have some third-party services that you've installed. But it will actually walk through and help you figure out what the services are, what the recommendation is for the Microsoft provided, and generally your vendors will provide this as well. It will help you document exactly what's going on for each of those services so that you'll know what you need to be looking at, why these are in place. All of these are documentation that later on you'll find very, very valuable. And then you'll actually be able to go through and do the columns of, right here as default, you get the web server 1 and 2 and app server 1 and 2. You can add any of your server roles or any of the actual server names that you're working with and be able to tie those in and show that here these services are actually supposed to go on specific servers or maybe on these load balance pieces or these clusters, and be able to specifically identify where each one of those capabilities are. And then these are actually very useful for auditing at a later point, so you can come back and make sure that as your system evolves, that the documentation is updated, that you actually always have current information, and that you know exactly what systems are being used for what purposes. If you're not doing a greenfield deployment, which means you actually have a previous SharePoint installation, this worksheet actually helps you go through and identify everything that you've got and how you actually do the upgrade planning. We'll discuss a bit more in upgrades in the installation module, but for right now you can actually, you can look and see which servers you have, identify which hardware you've got, what you're going to translate it to, and be able to do a full inventory of that. You'll be able to know which service applications you've got in place currently, which databases they're in, be able to know what you've got that needs to be migrated over, your web apps and site collections, which is probably one of the most important things to know of, to be able to go through and identify which ones those are, which the application pools, how they're authenticating, the providers and types, anonymous, SSL certificates. We can just walk through this, the name of itself, the URL, the default database server, which is very important, and then the database itself. As you're doing those migrations, you're going to need to have those planned out and know exactly what's going on. The site definition, which is where the users actually get to that content from. How customized is it? Does it have large lists, which you'll see becomes an issue when you're doing conversions? Who are the owners, so we know what to connect with and how to do their host names, load balance URL, etc., alternate name mapping URLs. All of these come into place because you're going to need those later on. So you actually collect all of those here and know what you're working with. The databases themselves, know what's going on, because SharePoint, as it grows, tends to have more and more databases. You want to know exactly which ones you've got, what you're doing with them, and how they come into play for doing the migration planning. Customizations. If you don't have customizations, then you won't need to worry about this, but just about everyone does. You'll go in there and you know if it's a feature, web part, event receiver, field type, all of those kind of things you can go into place. You can have the ID, the GUID that comes into place, the name and the description, how many users, where it's being used. Some of these will actually, you'll need to use some tools to come into place to pull them out. As you're doing the planning, if you don't have the proper tooling, you may need to have your developers go in and create some custom applications or applets to be able to come in and give you the information. The large list which we've identified, you need to know where they are, who the contact name is, how you can actually go in there to be able to work with those. The views themselves, if you've got custom URLs, a lot of these will come over acceptably, but just so you know what you've got, block file types is one of the things that you want to make sure you've got in there. You also probably want to know what you've actually made exceptions for in the block file type. So you can go in there and say, hey, we needed to add these in, they worked. We have, for whatever reason, we needed something, an extension that we actually need that by default is not allowed in there. So go through it. This upgrade worksheet lets you actually pull a full inventory of what you've got, lets you be prepared for the planning, and lets you actually go through that and know what you need to upgrade and what you need to manage as you're moving forward into your SharePoint 2013 environment. When you're working with the planning worksheets, you'll notice that not all of them are Excel spreadsheets. Many of them are, but not everything is there. You'll find some PDF forms and you'll find some Word documents like this. This worksheet is actually specifically around working on email. Just about every SharePoint installation has some type of email integration, at least for notifications and invitations, and many of them have incoming email as well. So you'll look here and you can actually go by what's going on, give you the overview, give you some details. There are actually some links here to tell you how to fill out the form, so it's nice and valuable in that mode. You can actually do your planning and make sure that you've got everything checked off in your list. Directory management services, Active Directory comes into play, your Exchange servers, how all of these pieces are going to go. Would you remember to check on the distribution groups? Most people would, some people might not. So you can actually go through and identify what you've already got, what's allowed, what the users are authenticated for. Directory management services, so you can actually go, if you've got management teams that are in different server clusters, you know to go and get the information that you need, be able to get your SMTP mail server, accepting messages from different locations and different pieces, put all those lists in, and be able to make it in place. Enabling incoming email is one of those pieces that often isn't thought about because a lot of users aren't aware of it or administrators have worried about it. This lets you go in and identify what you actually need and remind you of some of those capabilities. So if your users can actually use this, it would actually help them out with their day-to-day process. You can make sure that they've got it in place and that they can go forward and produce the best site that they can.